Good morning. Let us today discuss another historical play by Girish Karnad called The Dreams of Tipu Sultan. Like the previous play we discussed on Tughlaq, again Girish Karnad uses the historical life of Tipu Sultan as his raw material for the play The Dreams of Tipu Sultan. Before we discuss the play, let us first provide us with a historical context in which Tipu Sultan is being discussed and debated about even today. Tipu Sultan, who was born Sultan Fateh Ali Sahib Tipu in 1750, right, who was also known as Tipu Sahib, was the ruler of the kingdom of Mysore, which was a princely state. He was the eldest son of Sultan Hyder Ali of Mysore, and there are interesting details we know about his life which distinguish him from his father Hyder Ali in terms of their rule. So, unlike his father, who was focused more on the modernization of the military, of the army, Tipu Sultan focused a lot more on trade and commerce. So he struck many international trade links with France and several other countries. He turned to France for their latest technology on rockets and warfare, and that really shows even in the cannons and the rockets that he used, which are still present today in the Tipu Museum in Mysore. The capital of Mysore was Srirangapatna, and Srirangapatna was also known for its impregnable fort, a fortress which could not be easily penetrated by enemies, and that still exists today. Hyder Ali had put an end to the erstwhile Hindu rulers of Mysore, which were the Wadiyar family, which were of course reinstated once Tipu Sultan was defeated and killed by the British. Tipu Sultan had also tried to strike an alliance with Napoleon Bonaparte, and he had even sent an emissary, an envoy to Mauritius with the hope that Napoleon, as promised, would meet him in Mauritius after he had routed the Europeans, and would come and meet him and send forces to reinforce his own army against the British. Right? But that never happened. So the area of the Mysore kingdom, the princely state, included Malabar, and Tipu Sultan's father Hyder Ali rose to power, capturing Mysore, and Tipu Sultan succeeded his father Hyder Ali in 1782, following his father's death from cancer. There were many important victories that Tipu Sultan won against the British across the four wars, especially the first two wars that he fought against the British. The four wars that ended in Tipu Sultan's death were called the Anglo-Mysore Wars, which were fought from 1782 to 1799, when Tipu Sultan was killed. He succeeded Mysore upon his father's death in 1782. He won important victories against British in the second Anglo-Mysore War, and he also negotiated the Treaty of Mangalore in 1784 after his father's death. And Tipu Sultan also had many conflicts with his neighbors, which included the Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad. And so he also had to sign a treaty, the Treaty of Gajendragad, with at the end of the Maratha-Mysore War, which required Tipu Sultan to pay several million rupees as a one-time war cost to the Marathas, and an annual tribute of 1.2 million rupees, in addition to returning all the territory that his father Hyder Ali had captured. Tipu Sultan, till the very end of his life, remained an implacable enemy of the British East India Company, and he also sparked conflict with his attack on British allied Travancore, which was also a princely state, in 1789. In the third Anglo-Mysore War, he was forced into the Treaty of Seringamapatnam or Srirangapatnam, where he lost a number of previously conquered territories, including Malabar and Mangalore. He had also sent many emissaries to foreign states, including the Ottoman Empire, Afghanistan and France, in an attempt to rally opposition against the British. And it was in the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War where the British East India Company, with the help of the Nizam of Hyderabad, defeated Tipu Sultan, who was killed on 4th of May 1799 while defending his fort of Srirangapatna. The interesting thing about Tipu Sultan is that he was one of the few South Indian kings who actually provided stiff resistance to British imperialism along with his father Hyder Ali. He was, in historical accounts, applauded as a ruler who fought against British colonialism, but he was also seen as a very controversial figure who repressed Hindus and Christians. Now, we need to go into the debates. In fact, even today, the right wing, the BJP and the RSS, along with other leaders and parties, are actually debating over the celebration of Tipu Jayanti in Karnataka. And so it will be interesting to see what kinds of historical and official records they rely on to make these arguments for or against Tipu Sultan. Now, the main record that we see, one of the main histories that many of these right-wing activists and others, rely on, is Mir Hussain Ali Khan Kirmani's history of Tipu Sultan. Right? And Mir Hussain Ali Khan Kirmani also constitutes a character in the play Dreams of Tipu Sultan. And in the history of Tipu Sultan, he concludes that Tipu was a Muslim fanatic. But there have been many debates qualifying this claim that he was a rabid supporter of Islam and he needed Islam to actually rally people against the British. There's lots of evidence and information to suggest that he wasn't. One cannot just easily call him a Muslim fanatic. So, for instance, Mysore was called Musalman territory in the history, when a majority of its inhabitants were actually Hindu. And this information, many of these debates around Tipu Sultan can be read, can be found in certain few articles on JSTOR and EPW. One of them is called Tipu Sultan Giving the Devil, in quotes, his due, by Bhupendra Yadav. And then there's also a review of the historian Irfan Habib's edited collection called Confronting Colonialism, Resistance and Modernization under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, which was published by Tulika in 1999. And you also have another important article which explores the debates and the controversies around Tipu Sultan, which is called Sultan and the Saffron by Alex George. So these are all articles that you can easily find on EPW, on the Economic and Political Weekly, as well as JSTOR. Now, for example, in Bhupendra Yadav's article, Yadav argues that there were lots of pieces of information and evidence to show that one cannot simply dismiss Tipu Sultan as a Muslim fanatic. So, for one, there was the fact that Mysore was a Hindu majoritarian state, and there's also evidence to suggest that Tipu Sultan patronized several important Hindu monasteries and mutts. One, of course, is the Sringeri Mutt, to whom he was known to have given them many land grants and a lot of money and wealth to support the mutt and its activities. He also protected the mutt against the attacks by the Marathas to vandalize the idols in the mutt. One needs to also qualify the claims that are being made to prove that Tipu was a fanatic and a bigot, right? Because there's an instance where he was said to have exiled 60,000 Canarese Christians, right? And some scholars argue that the exiling of these Canarese Christians was apparently because they helped the British conquer Mangalore during the Second Anglo-Mysore War. Which is something that Tipu Sultan could not tolerate. Right? So, but on the other hand, Bhupendra Yadav argues that if Tipu Sultan were actually anti-Christian, then he would not have treated the Syrian Christians of his kingdom well, nor would he have encouraged Armenian merchants to settle in Mysore. Right, so it's one has to look at the nuances of this man's history to understand the basis for his actions. Right, so when he decided to actually patronize someone or an institution, or take care of certain communities which were under his rule, as opposed to attacking or exiling certain other people who belong to the same community, then there were very clear military and strategic reasons for doing so. So this is not to suggest that Tipu Sultan did not carry out forced conversions to Islam, especially from territories that were ceded to him or the territories that he actually conquered. But it's also important to qualify the numbers that official histories record of the number of people who actually converted to Islam. There are other instances of how Tipu Sultan requested the Archbishop of Goa to send Catholic priests for his Christian subjects who were neglecting their religious duties. So it was actually Tipu's own official court chroniclers who had a passion for Islamization. So Bhupendra Yadav makes a very interesting point when he says that it's these chroniclers who wanted their ruler to be perceived as followers, as ardent, intolerant followers of Islam. Of course, another very important instance to suggest that Tipu Sultan's also patronized Hindus were the presence of upper caste Hindus in his own court. One, of course, is Prime Minister Purnaya, who's also a character in the play. And then you also have Krishna Rao, Shyama Iyengar, who occupied very high positions in the court and also were his greatest confidants. Right? So it's not easy to just dismiss Tipu Sultan as someone who was anti-Hindu or anti-Christian. He also gifted land to temples and Brahmins, including those in Malabar, against whose Nayars Tipu took revenge. He also patronized and sponsored the construction of the Gopur temple in Kanjivaram, and even the temples within the Seringapatna fort flourished, including the Ranganatha temple, which flourished under his rule. He also made war on the rulers of Savanur, Kurnool, Adoni, Hyderabad and Carnatic, who were all Muslims. So again, this suggests that one cannot equate him simply as a Muslim fanatic who was against Hindus and Christians, because he does punish, he does wage war against fellow Muslims, just as he also rewards and patronizes Hindu Brahmins and institutions. The play Dreams of Tipu Sultan also portrays the ways in which Tipu Sultan could actually foresee the growing threat of the British Empire from its early days as a trading and mercantile agency to an administrative power. So he was very prescient in trying to pursue alliances with the Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad to actually fight against the British in a united fashion. But that, of course, fails because the British are very clever. They also realize that Tipu Sultan is a growing threat to their own monopoly in trade and power and economics, that they decide to suppress Tipu Sultan. They try to isolate him. They try to, of course, divide and rule. So even though the princes of India had signed treaties amongst themselves to keep off each of those territories. In fact, the Marathas had signed a treaty of perpetual peace with Tipu Sultan, and so there was an attempt to try and retain a semblance of peace and non-interference between the different princely states. But the British took advantage of this. They exploited the fact that there could be potential conflict between these different princely states and powers, and so they also saw the ways in which Tipu Sultan was growing as trading power and rather wealthy state, which boasted of one of the highest living standards in the world, so they actually wanted to suppress him, partly because he was striking alliances, both strategic as well as economic alliances with many other powers, including France. Actually drew a lot from the latest technology, warfare technology from France. He also tried to strike alliances. He sent letters to Arabia, to Persia, to Muscat, to Delhi, to Oudh, to Hyderabad and Pune. He also sent proposals to Jodhpur, Jaipur, and Kashmir, and he sent embassies to all these places in order to actually create a united front against the British. But obviously, all these attempts to try and create a united opposition to the British failed, and even the European traders, in fact, could not succeed in asserting or inserting a favorable provision on trade monopoly in the treaties with Tipu Sultan. So all the foreign merchants, the British merchants and businessmen, could not really flourish under the treaties with Tipu Sultan. So he was very particular to impose duties and taxes on these European merchants, British merchants. So he was finally defeated and killed in 1799 at the end of the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, after which he was, he had to sign a treaty and he had to cede half of his territory to the British. But he continued his resistance, which culminated in a further confrontation in which he had to face the combined might of the British, the Marathas, and the Nizam. So, as we discussed earlier, there are several pieces of information and data to suggest that the Sultan was not, purely a Muslim fanatic or somebody who was against Hindus and Christians, because, for example, he never imposed the jizya as Aurangzeb did on non-Muslim Muslims. He also had a close relationship with the Sringeri Mutt, and he was known to actually donate tax-free, rent-free land to temples and mosques and religious personae in South Malabar and Cochin. In fact, most of his religious land grants are to Hindu temples and Hindu religious persons more than Muslim mosques and Muslim religious institutions and leaders. He also made a huge grant of 669 acres. This is from Alex George's article, Sultan and the Saffron, of a huge grant of 669 acres to the Guruvayur temple of Kerala. And later on, the Sultan's introduction of land tax antagonized the landlord castes of Malabar and the Nambudiri Brahmins of Kerala in particular. And with the ascendancy of the Nayars, who were predominantly a military caste and had certain rights and land as well, they could no longer serve in the military or enforce privileges. And he also, for example, introduced dresses which would cover the bosoms of females, and he also disapproved of polyandry among Nayar women, which enraged the Nayars. And it was under him that the other lower castes flourished, the lower castes who worked under the upper castes flourished in their own ways. Many of them were military castes, many of them were also agrestic agricultural caste groups. So there has been an attempt in contemporary times to try and tarnish the complex and contradictory image of Tipu Sultan and reduce him to being someone who was a Muslim bigot, who was against Hindus and Christians. But it's important to also understand Tipu Sultan in a much wider and larger picture as someone who was also interested keen in trade and commerce, as someone who was very generous with his money and land to Hindu and Christian religious organizations and leaders, and also as someone who was not interested in only modernizing the military as his father was, but also was interested in striking collaborations and alliances with both foreign as well as other Indian princely states. So, to turn to the play now, let's look at some of the characters, who are the major characters in the play, right? So, you have Colin Mackenzie, who was an important Oriental missionary scholar who was responsible for collecting and preserving many important manuscripts from the south. You have Hussain Ali Kirmani, who is Tipu Sultan's official chronicler. You have Mark Wills, you have Suffer, you have Arthur Wellesley, who is the younger brother of the successive Governor General, the Earl of Mornington, Robert Wellesley, the Earl of Mornington. You have Nadim Khan, you have Tipu Sultan, you have Purnaya, who was his Hindu chief minister, and you have several other nobles from the court who end up betraying Tipu Sultan towards the end of his life in the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War. So you have Mir Sadiq, you have Ghulam Ali Khan, you have Osman Khan, you have Fath Haider, who is his older son, Muizuddin, Abdul Khalik. You have the representative of the first Governor General, Lord Cornwallis, Charles Malay. You have Nana Fadnavis, the ruler of the state of Pune, the Maratha state of Pune, and you have Rukaya Banu, Hasina, Lord Cornwallis, Kamaruddin, Hyder Ali, his father, who appears in a dream, Hari Pant, and the Colonel William Kirkpatrick. The first act is set in the house of the historian Mir Hussain Ali Khan Kirmani.
नहीं चल रहा। क्या? इतना आसान नहीं, तकलीफ होती है।
जनाब, हमेशा से यही कैसे आ रहे? अब छोड़िए, कितने साल गुजर गए उनकी मौत को।
जख्म नहीं भरे अभी। सच है कि एक अरसा हुआ कि खून और आंसू दोनों खुश्क हो गए, लेकिन जख्म तो अभी ताज़ा है।
हाँ, मैं समझ सकता हूँ कि आप उनके बहुत करीब थे, लेकिन आप एक मुरीद भी तो है। आपको एक ऑब्जेक्टिविटी के साथ काम करना होगा।
हाँ मुंशी साहब, यही बात आप एक अरसे से कह रहे हैं, ऑब्जेक्टिविटी, लातालुकी का फासला। क्या ऐसा मुमकिन है?
हद जरूरी है। मैं तो कहूँगा कि आपका फर्ज भी है।
तब तो आपको मुझे इस काम से बर्खास्त कर देना चाहिए। देखिए, आप मुझे तारीख लिखने के पैसे देते हैं और मैं बस बीमारी का बहाना बनाता हूँ।
I didn't mean that. मेरा ये मतलब नहीं था। And anyway, तुम्हारा कोई मुतबादी नहीं है you old rascal. तुम जैसे दरबार से जुड़े वकील को मैं इंतजार में तो नहीं कर सकता।
नहीं, शायद आप ये सोचते हैं कि बहाना बनाना भी हम दरबारियों की फितरत है।
No, I don't think that. बल्कि मेरा तो ये मानना है कि आप उनकी मौत से बहुत ज़्यादा obsessed हो गए हो।
मौत से नहीं, बल्कि जिस तरीके से उन्हें बर्बाद किया गया।
Surely you're being melodramatic now. अब आप इसे एक ड्रामाई शक्ल दे रहे हैं। जनाब फरमानी, हर सबूत चिल्ला कर कह रहे हैं कि उन्होंने खुद अपनी मौत चाही।
आपके लिए वो उन्हीं कुछ शवाहिदों से, कुछ मुबाहसों से बने हैं जो ये साबित करते हैं कि आप उन्हें खत्म करने में हक बचाने थे। और यही बात मेरी समझ से बाहर है। देखिए, तारीख का एक पहलू आपके पास पहले से ही है जो आपने गढ़ रखा है, तो फिर इसका दूसरा पहलू आप मुझसे क्यों जानना चाहते हैं? आपकी क्या दिलचस्पी है?
Yes, हमारी दिलचस्पी इसी दूसरे पहलू से। आप जो कह सकते हो कि ये हम फिरंगियों की ज़हनियत है, जो बात के दूसरे पहलू में भी दिलचस्पी रखते हैं। और शायद यही हमारी ताकत का राज है।
या तो खुद का ही पहलू समझने के लिए सारी जिंदगी नाकाफी है, और वैसे भी मेरी सारी जिंदगी उनके वालिद और उनकी खिदमत में गुज़री। और अब आपके लिए काम कर रहा हूँ जो उनके दुश्मन हैं। ये मेरे कौन से पहलू की निशानदेही करते हैं? दगाबाजी? क्या अब भी मैं भरोसेमंद हूँ? आप इस बात से परेशान नहीं हैं? मैं खुद परेशान हूँ।
जनाब हुसैन अली कुरमान, हमारी दिलचस्पी and वफादारी सिर्फ हिस्ट्री के साथ है। आपने जिस बात को इसमें शामिल ना करें, stick to the facts. As easy as that.
आपका मतलब याददाश्त? देखिए, यही वो नुक्ता है जहाँ असल दगाबाजी पाई जाती है। मैं अभी कुछ देर पहले ये याद करने की कोशिश कर रहा था कि वो अपने आखिरी वक्त कैसे नजर आ रहे हैं।
And like the previous play Tughlaq, this play is also about what it means to write history. What are the politics of writing history? How does one interpret and utilize official histories? What is the relationship between official history and, let's say, a certain memory, a certain personal memory of Tipu Sultan? And in fact, the first act is really about the very fraught relationship between memory and history, because Mackenzie represents a certain objective school of colonial missionary, history writing, which keeps away emotion in its objective truth claims about history, while Kirmani is someone who personally knew Tipu Sultan as his official chronicler, and but unfortunately he is not able to remember what Tipu Sultan's face looked like on the day he fell to the British and the Marathas and the Nizam. So it's really about the kind of battle between memory and history. So where official history ends, that's exactly where Kirmani's memory of Tipu Sultan begins, but it is a memory that is incomplete. It's blurred, and he's unable to capture all the details of Tipu Sultan's personality, his bearing, his emotions, and his facial expressions on the day he was killed. Kirmani also is unable to actually write complete history of Tipu Sultan because he feels terribly saddened by the fact that Tipu Sultan was betrayed by his own nobles on the day he died. And the play constantly switches back and forth between conversations between Kirmani and Mackenzie, who then become commentators in the background to the action that is taking place, that took place in the past. Right? So you have the play being framed initially by a conversation between Mackenzie and Kirmani, and then you have actual scenes that go that are flashbacks to actual scenes that are set, for example, in the fort of Srirangapatna, and to the time when after the war they are trying to look for Tipu Sultan's body and are unable to find it until one of the British Indian soldiers shines a torch on one of the bodies, which is undoubtedly Tipu Sultan's body, and the soldiers of course are completely shocked and saddened and start lamenting the loss of the Sultan. So for instance, in the initial debate between objective history and a certain affective emotional memory of Tipu Sultan, Mackenzie says to Kirmani, "That's understandable. There's no healing." Kirmani says there's no healing. "True, the blood and the tears dried up a long time ago, but the wound remains fresh." Mackenzie replies, "That's understandable. I mean, you were close to him, but you're also a historian. You need to develop a certain objectivity." Kirmani, "Yes, that's what you keep telling me, Mackenzie Sahib. Objectivity, dispassionate distance. Is that even possible? Is it possible to write an absolutely objective, emotionless history of a person, of a ruler?" And Kirmani is unable to acknowledge or overcome the way in which Tipu Sultan was destroyed through betrayal. Mackenzie says, "You're being melodramatic. Every bit of evidence we've gathered proves he asked for it." Kirmani, "Yes, for you he's made up of bits of evidence, bits of argument that prove that your side was right. And that's what I don't understand. You have your version of history all worked out. Why do you want my side? Why do you care?" Mackenzie, "I'm interested in the other side. You could say that's how we Europeans are brought up, to be interested in the other side as well. That, I suppose, is our strength." Right? So he seems to be making claims of objectivity because he's interested in what the other side has to say. But then, as Kirmani says, it's the British who have won ultimately, and it's their version of official history which will be embraced as the only version and received as the only version. Mackenzie says, "Our loyalty is to history, Kirmaniji." When Kirmani is very upset that he is now having to work for the very people who betrayed and killed Tipu Sultan, that he now has to work as their official historian, Mackenzie says, our loyalty is to history, Kirmani ji. Keep emotion out. Stick to the facts. Kirmani, you mean memories. But that's where the real betrayal lies. Do you know, I was just trying to remember what he looked like on the last day, and I just couldn't. And then later on, Kirmani reveals a letter that Tipu Sultan had given him just on the day of the war when he died. And it was a letter of his dream, right? So the dream that he gets just before he dies is a dream that also recurs towards the end of the play, right? So the entire play is framed by Tipu Sultan's last dream, a dream of absolute victory. And that is the last thing that he remembers about Tipu Sultan, his dream. When, of course, the body is discovered, Tipu Sultan's corpse is discovered, the soldiers completely lose respect. They have no respect for the corpse, and one of them chops one of Tipu Sultan's mustaches as a memento in his memory. So they kind of desecrate his body, and the entire kingdom of Mysore is looted after the war. Right? Women are raped, jewelry is stolen. The soldiers who have ransacked the entire city have looted it and pillaged the entire city. There's nothing left. There's also a reference to Tipu Sultan's attempt to try and seek Napoleon Bonaparte's support when he sends an embassy to Mauritius to the French ambassador Malartic, and that the British get to know. They intercept him and they intercept the supplies, and they make sure that Napoleon never reaches the coast of India. Kirmani also believes the dream, that the diary where Tipu Sultan had recorded and preserved his dreams should have been destroyed because it was personal, it was private. But for Mackenzie, even those diary of dreams is an objective evidence of Tipu Sultan's treachery, of Tipu Sultan's plans to secure a united opposition against the British. So nothing of that belongs to Tipu Sultan is left as a private object. Right? Everything is appropriated by the British. So for Kirmani, Tipu Sultan's diary was sacred and personal. Right? It was only until Munshi Habibullah discovered the diary and gave it to the British that they discovered all of Tipu Sultan's dreams, which symbolized his own ambitions for power. There are also descriptions towards the middle of Act 1 which describe Tipu Sultan's trade connections with the Emperor of China, who sends him a white elephant and horses as a token of their friendship and affection. He also has a dream. One of Tipu Sultan's first dreams is about how he dreams he's as powerful as Alexander, right? And this is, of course, a reference to the fact that the Emperor of China had only gifted a white elephant to the Alexander the Great, and the second person now was Tipu Sultan. So he kind of identifies himself with the supremacy, the territorial sovereignty of Alexander the Great. We also get information of how Tipu Sultan was well informed of the technological innovations in other empires. So he learns of a paper and currency being produced in China. He also discovers, or he learns of how they've been using silkworms to produce silk. So he imports silkworms from China to start his own silk industry. He also wants to consolidate his empire, his princely state, as a major trading power. Right? So he makes it very difficult for the government, for traders from abroad to actually flourish or carry out even their business in his own princely state because of the high taxes that he imposes on these traders. So he patronizes and sponsors only the government shops and warehouses, which completely scare off the other traders from outside, the private traders, the small traders who have come to carry out trade. They are completely intimidated by Tipu Sultan's government shops and warehouses. Tipu Sultan is also very keen on modernizing his own warfare technology. So he He wants to import a lot of glass, he wants to import guns, he wants to import cannons. So he says on 195 that we need glass, we need guns, we need cannons. Shall we keep buying them from abroad? So this emphasis that we should now try and produce our own warfare, military technology in order to flourish, and for which they need money. Right? So even for that we need money. And shall we be content with the pittance we get by taxing our businessmen when we have ivory and sandalwood freely available? Can an individual trader deal in sandalwood? For centuries we begged and borrowed silk from the Chinese, and everyone predicted disaster when I got a few eggs from China, and now we have a flourishing industry of our own. Shall we sit back like the stupid Nizam and the Marathas, who continue as though the English never existed, indeed as though the Europeans never existed? Any other male? So he's very aware of the necessity of developing his own internal trade and commerce in order to become a formidable power that could potentially keep stem British power and authority. And so he chastises, he derides and berates the other princely states like the Nizam of Hyderabad or the Marathas, who seem to not acknowledge the threatening presence of the British. He also tutors, he has a Persian tutor who teaches his sons Persian. So he's also very concerned that they should learn Persian and probably keep away from English, which is the language of the colonizer. He's also arranges for a royal delegation of Mysore to go to France through Pondicherry, right, which then becomes a French outpost, in order to actually secure the support of Napoleon Bonaparte to his own opposition against the British. He also realizes that the French have access to superior military technology. So he tells one of his nobles, Osman Khan, to be a messenger, an emissary to the French court. He tells Osman Khan, I'll give you a letter for King Louis XVI, but a letter is no substitute for direct persuasion. You must convince the king that if the French don't wake up, the English will gobble up the whole of India. The French here have become listless. The king must prod them, kick them if necessary, into activity. Louis and I could sign a treaty of perpetual alliance. Then if 10,000 French soldiers could march under me, make that clear. No separate treaties with the British or the other Indian princes. I give the orders. If the king could give me that little, we could change the face of India. Right? So he has a lot of foresight in seeking the French support to drive the British out of India. And he tells his other messenger, Ghulam Ali Khan, when you return, bring with you not just the 10,000 soldiers, but French craftsmen who could make guns, cannons, pistols. Right? So so even if he is keen on making his state economically viable and independent, he also seeks the support of foreign powers like the French and their own craftsmen who can produce the best guns, cannons, and pistols. He's also looking for opportunities for business with the Imam of Muscat, who Mir Sadiq says has fallen in love with the sandalwood and spices of our land and permitted us to build a factory for our products there. So he's keen on furthering business opportunities for trade industry. He also makes a list of professionals that they would need. So he asks his Chief Minister Purnaya to prepare a list which includes a doctor, a surgeon, a smelter, a carpenter, a weaver, a blacksmith, a locksmith, a cutter, and so on. And also a watchmaker, a dyer, and even a gardener who was then responsible for designing the beautiful garden of Lal Bagh, which still exists in Bangalore, and for which Tipu Sultan and his father Hyder Ali had also imported many seeds and saplings from all across the world. So he wanted to actually design Lal Bagh on the Garden of Versailles in France. So obviously Tipu Sultan is also drawing from Europe. Much as he detests the British as a formidable European power, he also draws a lot from the latest inventions in Europe, right, in the field of warfare as well as aesthetics, as well as gardening, painting, art, and so on. Right. So he says, he tells Osman Khan that you should bring in varieties of trees and flowers and bushes, and he said that's what makes Europe so wonderful. It's full of new ideas, inventions, all kinds of machines bursting with energy. Why don't we in our country think like them? And then he also discovers a new invention called the thermometer, which is supposed to actually measure body temperature, especially when one has fever. So they're completely amazed and struck by all these new inventions, and obviously Tipu Sultan wants to borrow and imitate these new European inventions. Unlike some of the other princely kings of the Marathas empire or the Nizam, Tipu Sultan is not intimidated by the British. He neither seeks their support nor is he intimidated by them. Right? Or for that matter, even the first Governor General, Lord Cornwallis, who initially led the British troops against in the American War of Independence, and was miserably defeated in that war, and was then made Governor General of India. So Tipu Sultan is very aware of the fact that the British and the French are arch enemies, and that even though they have signed the Treaty of Versailles, where they will not interfere in the local affairs of each other's colonies, Tipu Sultan realizes that he can still exploit the differences, because he knows that the French and the English can never remain friends forever. So he does want to actually exploit the differences that they already have, their rivalry. So he is completely contemptuous of Cornwallis for having lost the American War of Independence against George Washington, who was just a farmer. So he does not think of him as a threat, or even as a rival worth considering. He is convinced that if he is able to strike alliances and put up a united opposition to the British, that he will be able to drive them out of the country. Then there's another scene encounter between Nana Fadnavis of the Maratha court and Charles Malle, who is the representative of Lord Cornwallis. So in principle, the East India Company is supposed to have adopted a very pacific attitude of non-interference against the Indian princely states. Right? So they have no intention of entering into confrontation with any of the Indian princes. And Charles Malle claims that the allies of the British, which include the Scindias, the Maratha chiefs, the Nizam of Hyderabad, and the Nawabs of Karnataka and Oudh, and the Rajas of Travancore and Cochin, right, are supporters of the British, right? But he perceives Tipu Sultan as a growing threat to the British monopoly and supremacy in finance and commerce. And so even though the Maratha Empire has signed a treaty of perpetual peace with Tipu Sultan, that Charles Malle is unwilling to actually accept that as a sacrosanct agreement, and he tries to win over the Nana's support in order to fight Tipu Sultan. But Nana Fadnavis is certain to actually honor the treaty that he signed with Tipu Sultan, to not interfere with each other. There's also reference to the Second Anglo-Mysore War, where the Treaty of Mangalore was forced upon the British, who were defeated by Tipu Sultan. And basically under Lord Cornwallis, nothing can be done about Tipu Sultan's growing power. So even though Lord Cornwallis's plan is to make the Marathas and the Nizam join powers with the British East India Company, that they're unable to actually manage the war against Tipu Sultan. They decide to actually declare war on Tipu Sultan independently of each other, attacking him from three directions. But that never happens, because Tipu Sultan and his father they've been responsible for actually fighting the Marathas and the Nizam in the past, and taking away, dispossessing them of a considerable part of their territory. So the Marathas know they have no hope of facing Tipu Sultan and defeating him single-handedly, which is why they need the power. They need the support of the Nizam and the British. And with the French military support of Tipu Sultan, he has become indeed a formidable opponent that no one can hope to defeat single-handedly. Later on, towards the end of Act 1, Tipu Sultan again acknowledges the contribution of the British, who have taught him trade. He says, "My father taught me war, and the English taught me trade. They taught me that the era of the camel is over, and it is now the age of the sailing ship." Right. So obviously, Tipu Sultan has learned a lot. He draws a lot from the superior technology of the British, which is why he needs access to the sea, right, and sea trade and to ships, which for him would be the greatest source of power, because it would ensure his alliance with Napoleon and the reinforcements of arms and weapons and craftsmen through the sea. But towards the end of the third Mysore British War, when Lord Cornwallis attacked or invaded Mysore in 1790, the Nizam and the Marathas also launched parallel attacks. And there's a war, and by the end of which Cornwallis enters the foot of the fort of Seringamapatnam, but is unable to attack it or capture it because it is such an impregnable fort. And so he's unable to actually defeat the Tipu Sultan, and on the return journey the English forces run into the Marathas with their abundant supplies, and the two forces again attack Srirangapatnam. So Tipu Sultan is finally forced to sue for peace, for which Lord Cornwallis has 4 conditions. One, of course, is that all the English prisoners who were taken by Tipu Sultan had to be released unconditionally, considering that the British prisoners of war had been ill-treated, ill-treated by Tipu, while they claim that the Indian prisoners of war that had been captured by the British had not been ill-treated, that they had still been treated with a certain degree of respect. They had not been tortured. The second condition, of course, is that Tipu Sultan would have to cede half of his domain, which was adjacent to the territories of the English, the Marathas and the Nizam. Right? So a lot of the land that became part of the Mysore Empire, or the Mysore state, had been conquered and captured by his father Hyder Ali. Right? So a lot of these territories had to be given back to the Marathas and the Nizam and the British. And he also, the other condition, of course, is that he pay an indemnity of 6 crores, 6 crore rupees as an indemnity as the cost for war. And the last condition is that he send 2 hostages to the British to be kept under them until the terms of the treaty are duly fulfilled. Right? So he sends 2 of his older sons to the British, so that the British can ensure that Tipu Sultan honors the 4 conditions of the treaty. The four conditions being that he release all British English prisoners of war, that he cede or give up half of his domain to which are the territories adjacent to the English, the Marathas and the Nizam, and that he also pay an indemnity of 6 crores, and finally that he give 2 hostages, namely his 2 sons, as hostages to the British until the conditions of the treaty are honored. So Tipu Sultan has no choice but to send Fath Hyder and his second son to the British, because he has faith in the English that they will not harm the children, they will not poison them or kill them, for there is no financial profit in it. Right? So he is convinced that they will not harm his children. But the greatest danger that he fears is that the British will teach his children English, which is exactly what he doesn't want. He doesn't want his children to learn English or to imitate the technological marvels of the British or be seduced by the magic of their technology. Tipu Sultan is not willing to give up so easily to the British. Even though he seems to honor all the conditions, he fights them till the tooth and nail to the very end. And he has a dream, one more dream about his father, Hyder Ali, who appears. And the conversation is like this. He says, Tipu says, "Where are you, father?" And Hyder says, "Here, under this tree." Tipu, "Under this? Father, why are you lying there? What's happened to you?" Hyder, "I'm maimed, Tipu, I have no limbs." So Hyder Ali in the dream is limbless. "But you never lost any limb. You have maimed me, Tipu," Hyder says. "You've cut off my limbs and handed them over to the enemy." Tipu, "Yes, father, I've done that. Have you come to punish me?" Hyder, "What punishment would be adequate, do you think?" Tipu, "I don't know, father. You remember once I messed up your campaign and you gave me a lashing, almost skinned me alive. My body still bears those welts, such scars that I am ashamed to undress in front of anyone. This crime is much worse than that." So he obviously, it's a dream which expresses Tipu Sultan's guilt, severe guilt for having given up his sons as hostages to the British. I can't do that now. I have no arms, Hyder Ali says. Tipu, shall I lash myself for you? Hyder, no melodrama, I pray you. No hysterics, please. You've gone soft. You spend too much time with your account books. Tipu, you spend your life on horseback, making conquests. I have to consolidate your gains. That can't be done on horseback. The English are stronger now. So the dream also expresses the differences between Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. During Hyder Ali's time, he was more keen on modernizing the military, and he did not have the access to the kind of technology that Tipu Sultan later had. So a lot of the conquests that Hyder Ali made were made on horseback, while now Tipu Sultan is thinking about ships, for instance, and the English, who are now a much stronger power than they ever were. And whose fault is it, Hyder Ali asked, that the English are stronger? Tipu, I hate them, and they returned the compliment. Hyder, then why did you let Cornwallis escape? When he was retreating from Seringamapatnam in shame and desperation, your Amirs and Khans begged you to attack. You stood on the ramparts and I did nothing. Tipu, I was paralyzed. Hyder, you let Cornwallis go. Tipu, you would have made mincemeat of him, I know, but I vacillated. Hyder, you're scared of him. Tipu, no, I'm not. If I was scared, I would have ordered a slaughter. But father, often, suddenly, I see myself in them. I see these white skins swarming all over the land, and I wonder what makes them so relentless, desperate. Most of them are no older than Fath Hyder. What drives these young lads to such distant lands through fever, dysentery, alcohol, so often to death, wave after wave? They don't give up, nor would I. Sometimes I feel more confident of them than my own people. What makes them so unsparing towards themselves? Is it only money? Hyder, you're beginning to think like a trader. Tipu angrily, no, if it was only for money, they would betray each other. But there's never any treachery against their own kind, no backstabbing. They believe in the destiny of the race. Why can't we? When our fort was besieged by Cornwallis, I knew several of my officers had already started secret negotiations with him. I even knew who they were, my trusted officers, yet I couldn't expose them without bringing the whole edifice down. I had to keep saying they were the true pillars of my kingdom, that I depended on their loyalty to me and my family, and hope for the best. Hope that when the moment came, they wouldn't stab me in the back. But the English fight for something called England. What is it? It's not a religion that sustains them, nor a land that feeds them. They wouldn't be here if they did. It's just a dream, for which they're willing to kill and die. Children of England. They have conquered our land, plundered its riches, and now they've started taking away my children. So Tipu admires the British for their loyalty to their own country and towards each other. They never seem to backstab each other. They never betray each other like Tipu Sultan's own officers or like the other princely states of India, who are unable to actually unite with him in their opposition against the British. Many of them are bought over and bribed by the British and their power and the riches and their hopes for jobs and employment in the British Empire. So Tipu Sultan here emerges as a very principled man who will not compromise his rule and his people. In his encounter with Hari Pant, who is in the Maratha camp, again we see the difference in the responses between Tipu Sultan, who was indignant and enraged by the British and their threat, while Hari Pant believes he doesn't seem to have Tipu Sultan's sense of indignation and courage, and that he would rather support the British like the Nizam than fight them, because they don't have the supplies, the forces, or the courage to actually stand up to the British. In fact, the Maratha Empire is only interested in ensuring that they get their lost territories back from Tipu Sultan, and so including Kodagu, the province of Kodagu, and so they're not really interested in uniting with Tipu Sultan. And Tipu says, so while Hari Pant believes that Lord Cornwallis has been honest in redistributing the territory which Hyder Ali had once captured from the Marathas, Tipu says in response, he laughs and he says, you have what, Hari Pant? How can you say that without blushing? Because Hari Pant says that we have a third share of our joint conquest. And Tipu says that the share that you have been given is what my father had won from you, Marathas, 40 years ago. what you've got is only a restitution of your earlier possessions. And in return, you have given the English new territories, Salem, Dindigul, the Malabar coast with its coconuts and pepper and its magnificent ports. You are back where you were, while the English now have the entire coastline of India. So he resents Hari Pant for giving up certain very important territories which are strategically located along the coast, giving the British access to the coast and to sea trade. And remember, they are a seafaring power. Mine is a landlocked kingdom, so I thirst for the sea. For today, the sea is the key to power, to prosperity. You have the whole of the western coast, and instead of keeping the English out, you have permitted the shark into your waters and are trying to swim along with it. So Tipu Sultan realizes the importance of the sea, and considering his own state is landlocked, that he needs access to the sea to actually get replenishments and forces from the French, and also to carry out his several trade agreements. So he is absolutely contemptuous of the Marathas' lack of courage and for honoring the treaties of the British instead of fighting them. And of course, the second Governor General, Richard Wellesley, who was the second Earl of Mornington, is a far more severe and determined Governor General than Cornwallis. He and his brother and the Colonel William Kirkpatrick ensure that Tipu Sultan is finally vanquished. So the Earl of Mornington, Robert Wellesley, is determined to defeat Tipu Sultan because he realizes that Tipu Sultan has grown stronger ever since Lord Cornwallis left by building a trading empire on a European model, which becomes an immense success. So considering the British have managed to keep the French and the Dutch out of India, and they've also contained the Portuguese, that they cannot tolerate the native prince, forming a rebellion, a revolt against them. So even though Tipu has had peaceful relationships with the East India Company for 7 years, Mornington decides that now is the time to attack him, precisely when he's least prepared for an attack or a war on him. So ultimately they do end up entering the fort with the help of some of Tipu Sultan's officers who betray him, and they do end up killing Tipu Sultan towards the end. And his descendants are basically doled out on a pension, and they're sent off to Calcutta, where they're kept under the surveillance of the British. So while the other British, princely states are given a rich amount of money from the British, the colonial state after independence, the British reinstate the Wadiyars in Mysore, and they exile Tipu's descendants to Calcutta, where they are kept under surveillance. And so the entire play revolves around that one dream of Tipu Sultan that he has just before he sets out for his last war, which seems to suggest that, and he in fact consults the astrologer, one of the important astrologers of Chennapatna, who predicts that he will win the war, which he ironically does not. So the play actually ends on a very ironic note, where Tipu Sultan's dream of absolute power and glory is not fulfilled, and he ends up being killed, and his descendants, while the other royal princely states are royally rewarded by the British Indian state after independence for their loyalty, it's the descendants of Tipu Sultan who are left to rot in poverty in the slums of Calcutta. Right. So that's it. Thank you.